Hello, I'm Sophie Ikenya. Welcome to Focus on Africa. Our top stories. 25 soldiers are killed in Niger in the increasingly dangerous fight against Islamist militants in the Sahel. A slice of the pie. Ethiopia's state-owned telecoms giant is going private. We hear the horrifying story of a South African woman tricked into sexual slavery by a friend and ask what can be done to protect others from such fate.
Oh, that worst kick you get in your stomach, and I was being undressed, getting tied up, duct tape around my eyes.
Also in the program, these presidential boots were made for walking. Why Uganda's President Yoweri Museveni trekked nearly 200 kilometers across Uganda in a week. And in sports, some breaking news in the last hour. Kenya's Wilson Kipsang, who won an Olympic bronze medal at London 2012, is suspended for doping violations. Thanks for joining us on Focus on Africa from BBC World News. It's been a frontline in the war against Islamist militancy for many years. Despite thousands of soldiers on the ground in Niger, including French troops, the number of attacks in the region is increasing. In the most recent offensive by suspected jihadists, 25 Niger soldiers were killed at a military camp along the country's western border with Mali. Well, let's get more now from our correspondent, Louise Dewas. What happened?
Well, details are still emerging, but we know that this attack took place on a military outpost just a few kilometers from the Malian border. Now, this is an area known as the Liptako-Gourma region and overlaps Niger, Burkina Faso and Mali. And this is where 71 soldiers were killed in another attack just a month ago. Now, while yesterday's attack has not yet been claimed, we know that militants linked to Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State group operate in this area. Now, while armed groups have been in this region for several years, in recent months, there's been what the UN has described as a devastating surge in attacks on soldiers, but also on civilians. Last night, the spokesperson for Niger's army made a statement on national television in Niger. Take a listen.
The response, with the combined air support of the Niger Air Force and partners, made it possible to strike and rout the enemy outside our boundaries. The Minister of National Defense, on behalf of the President of the Republic, Supreme Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, and on behalf of the government, offers his heartfelt condolences to the victims' families and wishes a prompt recovery to the injured.
Louise, do we know why there's been an upsurge in attacks in the Sahel region recently?
Well, Sophie, just to give a bit of context, this crisis in the Sahel goes back to 2012 when separatist militants took over the northern part of Mali. The French intervened to help the Malians push them back. A peace deal was signed in 2015, but it wasn't fully implemented, and new armed groups have emerged and expanded to central Mali, to Burkina Faso, and to Niger as well. And there are many reasons why these groups are expanding. They are profiting from porous borders, for example. They're also profiting from little state presence in some of these areas. And we also understand that in those areas that they control, so to say, they are integrated in local and illicit activities like drug trafficking, human trafficking, weapons trafficking. And these activities enable them to survive and to expand. But what's becoming more and more clear is that a military-only response is not enough to address this crisis, and that issues such as youth unemployment, but also climate change, also need to be urgently addressed.
Issues there. Louise Dewas for us there in Dakar. Thank you. Well, on Monday, France and the Sahel G5 countries, that's Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, Chad and Mauritania, will meet in France to address the French military's presence in the region. Well, BBC Afrique's Lamine Konkobo is there for us. Lamine, what is expected to be discussed there, and what are they expecting out of it anyway?
Sophie, what is under discussion at the summit is, of course, the future of the French troops in the Sahel region. Recently, the troops have come under increasing pressure from activists who want the French troops out there. And the president of France, Emmanuel Macron, seems not to understand why the troops, while they are dying there fighting terrorism, some people in Africa would be calling for them to get out. So he has called for this meeting so as to seek what he said, clarifications whether they should stay on or indeed leave. And what is expected out of this meeting, Emmanuel Macron said that he has taken into account what the activists are saying and that all the options are on the table, including a withdrawal. But experts who are very knowledgeable on French-African issues tell me that they talk about withdrawal is a bidding war. It is Emmanuel Macron playing brinksmanship so as to pile pressure on the African leaders that, in fact, no withdrawal will be decided when they meet in Po on Monday.
All right, Lamine Konkobo, you are our ears there on the ground. Thank you. Well, let's now take a quick look at other stories making headlines across Africa and the rest of the world. Large crowds have gathered in Mali's capital, Bamako, to protest against the French military presence in the country ahead of that summit in France. Paris sent in troops after militant groups took over much of northern Mali in 2012. Its operation in the Sahel region is now its largest overseas military mission. And the former president of Central African Republic, Michel Djotodia, has returned to the capital, Bangui, 7 years to the day after he left the country. Mr. Djotodia stood down 10 months after seizing the presidency in 2013. But despite various peace agreements, much of CAR is still controlled by armed groups. On his arrival, Mr. Djotodia said 2020 will be a year of peace. The Duchess of Sussex has flown back to Canada to be with her 8-month-old son, Archie. It follows the news that she and her husband, Prince Harry, are stepping back from their roles as senior members of the royal family. It's still not clear precisely what Harry and Meghan will do, but the Queen has asked her officials to come up with a workable agreement. Now, Ethiopia has announced plans to privatize state-controlled Ethio Telecom. It's one of the two only surviving telecommunication companies that's wholly owned by the state in Africa, the other country being Eritrea. Ethio Telecom has more than 60 million subscribers, and this, together with Ethiopia's fast-growing mobile market, it's attracting global investors and promises to transform the country's telecommunications industry. The BBC's Emmanuel Igunza reports.
This is one of Africa's fastest-growing economies. Over the last decade, Ethiopia's economy has grown by double digits. But that growth has been slowed down by the tight control maintained by the government in critical sectors like aviation, financial and telecommunications. All that is, however, set to change with new plans to liberalize the economy. And first up is what many analysts consider to be one of the country's crown jewels, the giant government monopoly Ethio Telecom. The government is in advanced plans to sell shares in the state corporation and also allow foreign telecommunication companies to start operating in the country. And it's easy to see why so many international investors want a piece of the cake. With a subscriber base of 44 million people, Ethio Telecom has the largest single-country customer base in the continent. In the last financial year 2017-2018, the company generated $1.2 billion in revenue, a 7% jump from the previous year. Regional and international telco giants Safaricom, MTN, Etisalat and Vodafone have all expressed interest in penetrating this largely untapped market. Well, despite this huge potential, the telecommunications sector in Ethiopia has largely lagged behind as compared to neighboring countries like Kenya, where technological advances like mobile banking have helped to spur the economy. Could privatization be the key? The government believes so. It hopes opening up to foreign investors will bring much-needed competition and foreign expertise that will improve services here.
This sector would unlock a lot of opportunities for the youth. It would probably help the country also run faster, for sure, in all sectors. But it requires communication. Do everyone understand it in this manner? Do people feel it's a little bit rushed? Or is there just sentimental attachment to entities that were there for years? Yes. But I think as we go on deeper communication, as the public understands what it brings, it is becoming more and more clear.
The immediate beneficiaries will be ordinary Ethiopians who for decades have been restricted to access to services like the internet and poor telecoms infrastructure. The opening up of Ethiopia's telecommunication marks the beginning of liberalization of the economy of this country, but one that could potentially change for the better the fortunes of this economic giant.
Emmanuel Igunza reporting there. Now, the United Nations estimates that millions of people globally are victims of human trafficking, many of whom are left traumatized by their horrific experiences. Griselda Grootboom was trafficked into prostitution in South Africa by someone she thought was a friend. She was just 18 years old and living in a shelter in Cape Town. Let's hear her story.
I tried to go to school that year, and that same year is where I met a friend. We became close. She would walk with me to my shelter, change, and I would walk with her. We became very, very close. And that's when the same year where she's like, okay, she's moving to Johannesburg because her family was moving and she needs to study. And I was like, okay, maybe I can come with her because she knew who I was. She didn't judge me. And she's like, oh, yeah, okay, if you find a way, then you can come. Took the train from Cape Town, got to Joburg, extremely excited of a new life. She went to go get me food, and that was the last time I saw her. And I took a nap because I had a long journey. I was woken up by 3 guys. The only thing I knew was that worst kick you get in your stomach, and I was being undressed, getting tied up, duct tape around my eyes. And as it happens, I got, they injected me behind my knees. My lower body started to get really numb as the drug was going through my veins. As time went by, clients started to come in. They were doing whatever they wanted to do. It would be all day if there was any, and then it would be all night or so. And in my head, I started counting backwards to count how long the person takes. And this probably went on in my head for 2 weeks or 12 days because it was every day. If you didn't do what they wanted to, you get smacked, punched.
Well, let's get more on this with Dr. Carrie Pemberton-Ford from the Cambridge Center for Applied Research in Human Trafficking. Thanks for taking time to talk to us on Focus on Africa. Now, most countries in Africa have laws that deal with human trafficking, and yet we rarely see prosecutions. Why is that?
Well, that's something that's a bit of a global problem. You see more victims being discovered than the prosecutions successfully going through. Year on year across the world, we're seeing prosecutions starting to rise as the criminal justice system gets on board with what it takes to bring a successful prosecution. But first of all, you need to have a really well-primed law enforcement response where the victims are being properly protected and therefore they're able to give the best evidence against those who have been so abusing them, and then a prosecution can start hopefully to get underway. But this is expensive, it's resource heavy, and the training that's required for the front end staff is really, really important.
Is there a distinct trafficking pattern, say, from various regions in Africa?
Well, there are various patterns in Africa. You have domestic trafficking inside most of the countries. You have those who are bordering each other, movement across, because ease of movement is one of the key components of trafficking networks. And then, of course, you have the international movement, and the international movement from African countries can be for particularly more Muslim countries, a tendency to move into the Middle East. For more Christian-based countries, then that has been traditionally moving along with the colonial ties up into Europe. And then, of course, you've got some movement across into Malaysia and Oceania.
What advice would you give anyone who's in a vulnerable position where they could easily be trafficked?
Well, I mean, I think what we need is in our education system much more awareness and alertness to grooming patterns for sex trafficking, because that's the case that was profiled in your show earlier to me, but also labour trafficking and trafficking into armed conflict, organ trafficking. These are all abuses that are happening in the trafficking container. So we have to start educating both those who could become victims, but also educating states that this is not only the devastation on individuals, but it's a sort of state sabotage because the dereliction of rights that takes place, and then the monetary capacity for criminal enterprises and indeed terrorist enterprises to fulfill their plans, which are hostile to civil rights, civic rights, and the state's responsibility to look after all its citizens. Those are then replenished through this trafficking, these trafficking patterns.
So there needs to be education. Dr. Carrie Pemberton-Ford, thank you very much indeed for taking time to talk to us and Focus on Africa. Thank you.
It's a pleasure.
Well, this is Focus on Africa from BBC World News. Still to come, we'll have the latest on Kenya's Wilson Kipsang, the decorated distance runner who's been suspended for doping violations. I'm Sophie Ikenya, and you're watching Focus on Africa from BBC World News. The top story on this program: a suspected jihadist attack on a military camp in Niger has left at least 25 soldiers dead. The army says more than 60 militants died. Now, a 6-day walk along his route to power, Uganda's President Yoweri Museveni has retraced the path he took across the country when his guerrilla forces seized power in 1986. Now, during the almost 200-kilometer trek, Mr. Museveni stopped to thank locals for supporting the revolution and handed out envelopes of money. Critics have dismissed it as a stunt ahead of Uganda's elections next year. Well, the BBC's Alan Kasuja interviewed Mr. Museveni in October and joins me now. Alan, you are the last person who interviewed Mr. Museveni from the BBC. Why is this journey so important to him?
So here's the problem, and I encountered this in the course of making a documentary about the Bush War. Uganda has a very young population. Majority of the country was born after President Museveni took power in 1986. And so when you interact with them, when he tries to tell them the importance of the war that they fought between 81 and 86, a lot of young people can't relate. They don't understand the significance of that war, the need to have that war in the first place. And so to try to address that, what President Museveni has done, and this is why he took on this walk, is to bring the young people in, tell them the story, so that next time he goes back and says, well, in 1986, this is what Uganda was like. There'll be people saying, yeah, okay, this sounds a bit more familiar. They'll engage with the story more, and hopefully, depending on who you're speaking to, be a bit more curious about the underlying reasons for going.
When you interviewed him, what stayed with you, Alan?
A couple of things. Actually, I was pleasantly surprised as to how organized State House is. It functions quite. I don't go there a lot, so it was interesting to see that things work as they should. Number two, President Museveni's sense of humor. First time he saw me, he said, who brought this monster here? Because I'm not the smallest person he's ever seen. But also just how busy he is. There were ministers, investors, a cocktail of people all waiting to see him. So that struck me. At his age, I was surprised at how busy his schedule seems to be.
Busy, you say, but he's been doing a lot of walking, a lot of exercises. I wonder what the message is that he's trying to send.
You can speculate about the political message behind that. But, 75, 76 this year, hoping to run for office again at the next election next year, doing at least 70 kilometers of that trek on foot. It sends a message of sorts. And I think he's also been keen to encourage people to get into shape. And also the people around him, and I spoke to one of them today, said that it was important for him to engage with the people who supported him in the Bush War. So there are a lot of things. To say that I haven't forgotten you, to say that I'm still in shape, you can infer that from the fact that he decided to do the war.
All right. Quite interesting. Alan Kasuja, thank you.
Good to be here.
You're watching BBC Focus on Africa. Let's find out what's happening in the world of sport. And Victoria Nwahunda is here with us today.
Thank you, Sophie. Well, in the last hour, it's been announced that former marathon world record holder and 2012 Olympic bronze medalist Wilson Kipsang has been provisionally suspended from the sport for doping violations. Kipsang set what was then the world's fastest time back in 2013 at the Berlin Marathon. Well, now my colleague Peter Msembi is in the BBC newsroom and joins me now. Peter, what more do we know?
Victoria, so far what we know is that the Athletics Integrity Unit, that is the watchdog body for combating doping in athletics, has announced on Twitter that Wilson Kipsang has been provisionally suspended for doping violations. They say he's been suspended for whereabouts violations and tampering. Not much detail has been released about that. As I said, they've announced on Twitter. And it is a requirement for all top athletes to always declare their whereabouts to the organization because of out of competition doping tests, which are carried out randomly. I'd say that Wilson Kipsang is a high-profile athlete, is a former world record holder in marathon, a feat set in Berlin in 2013. He's won London Marathon twice, New York Marathon, Tokyo Marathon. He won bronze at the London Olympics in 2012. So quite a high-profile athlete.
Thank you, Peter Msembi there. We will wait for some Wilson Kipsang statement later on. Hopefully it will arrive. Now, a bit of good news for Manchester United and their manager, Ole Gunnar Solskjaer, and of course the fans, the imminent return of defender Eric Bailly. The Ivorian will be featured on a reserve match on Friday evening following an injury-laden 2019. He only made 7 appearances for the Reds in all competitions. The 25-year-old last featured for the club in their 1-1 draw with Chelsea last April.
We got Eric and Tim, they're playing tonight in the reserves, which is a great step forward for them, and hopefully they'll get through that to then be available for us again. They've been training well for a month now, so let's see how they are tonight.
Well, Sophie, that's all the sport for tonight.
Thank you, Victoria. Well done. Thank you. Now, we end the program in Mali, where one of Africa's most prestigious photography festivals is celebrating its 25th anniversary. Bamako Encounters brings together work from 85 photographers from the continent and the diaspora. Thank you for your company. Have a good weekend.
Mali, Mali,